Welcome to Nachtmeier Witness. Some nights feel wrong before anything happens. The air feels heavy, the room feels colder, and somewhere in the dark, you get the strange feeling that you are being watched. Tonight, you will hear stories from people who became witnesses to things they never expected to see. Some saw someone standing in the shadows. Some heard voices with no one nearby. Others found themselves in places that did not feel real at all. Before we begin, leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from tonight. And if you enjoy true scary stories with a slow, dark atmosphere, subscribe to Nachtmeier Witness. Get comfortable. The night has already begun. This is not exactly a horror story, but it is one of those hospital memories that has stayed with me for years because of how quickly it went from serious to completely unbelievable. I was 15 years old when I got a concussion. I do not remember every detail of how it happened, but I remember enough to know that my parents and I were worried. A concussion can be hard to judge from the outside. You may look mostly normal while feeling confused, dizzy, tired, or sick. Head injuries can also become dangerous if there is bleeding or swelling inside the skull, so my mother took me to the emergency room to have my head checked. At 15, I tried to act calmer than I really felt. I did not want to seem frightened, but I was nervous. I knew the doctors wanted to scan my head, and even though everyone said it was only a precaution, the fact that I was in the emergency room made the situation feel serious. Hospitals always have a strange atmosphere, especially when you are waiting for test results. There are people rushing around, machines making noises, and staff members speaking in calm voices, even when something bad may be happening. You sit there trying to read their expressions and work out whether you should be worried. My mother stayed with me while we waited. The room was not private. It had 3 beds, and each bed was separated from the others by hanging sheets or curtains. The sheets could stop people from seeing one another, but they could not block any sound. If someone spoke at a normal volume in the next section, you could hear nearly every word. It was the kind of room where strangers were technically given privacy, but everyone still knew what was happening around them. My bed was in one section, and the other 2 spaces were either empty or being used by other patients. My mother sat near me while we waited for someone to take me for the scan or come back with information. I was sore and probably had a headache, but I was stable. Nobody was running around my bed or shouting orders. Most of the time, we simply sat there listening to the normal noise of the emergency department. Then staff members brought a small child into the room. He was a toddler, probably young enough that he did not understand where he was or why strangers in medical clothing wanted to touch him. He had a deep cut just below one of his eyes. There was a lot of blood. Cuts on the face can bleed heavily, even when they are not life-threatening, and the area around the eye is especially sensitive. The child was already frightened and upset before anyone tried to treat him. He was crying, moving around, and clearly wanted to leave. His parents were with him, trying to calm him down. From the little we could see before the curtain was closed, the cut looked serious enough to need proper treatment. It was close to the eye, which made everything more difficult. The doctor had to repair the wound without getting anything into the eye or damaging the skin around it. The child, of course, did not understand any of that. All he knew was that he was hurt, there was blood on his face, and several strangers were trying to make him lie still. The doctor placed him on the examination table, or bed, in the section beside us. Then, someone pulled the curtain across, so my mother and I could no longer see what they were doing. We could still hear everything. At first, there was a lot of crying and movement. The parents spoke softly to their son, trying to reassure him. The doctor and nurses explained what they were doing and asked the parents to help keep him calm. The staff cleaned the blood away from the cut. That alone seemed to upset the child. Even gentle cleaning can hurt when a wound is fresh, and toddlers do not usually stay still just because an adult tells them something will only take a moment. He cried louder whenever someone touched the area below his eye. My mother and I sat quietly on our side of the curtain. We were not trying to listen, but it was impossible not to. The room was small, and there was only a thin sheet between us and the treatment. Every cry and every instruction came through clearly. After cleaning the wound, the doctor decided to close it with medical glue. That sounded reasonable. Medical glue is often used for certain cuts because it can close the skin without the need for stitches. For a small child, avoiding needles around the face was probably a good idea. But the cut was directly below the child's eye. The doctor needed to apply the glue very carefully. If the child moved suddenly, the glue could end up somewhere it was not supposed to be. The staff knew that. The parents knew it too. The doctor explained that the child needed to remain completely still for a few moments while the glue was applied. That is much easier to say than to achieve with a frightened toddler. The child had already been crying, moving, and trying to pull away. He did not understand that the doctor was helping him. To him, the doctor was another stranger coming close to the injured part of his face. The doctor asked the parents to help hold him down. They needed to keep his arms, legs, and head still long enough for the wound to be sealed safely. The parents agreed. They probably hated the idea of restraining their own child, but they also understood that the cut had to be treated. If he moved while the doctor was working, the injury could become worse. On our side of the curtain, my mother and I could feel the mood in the room change. The crying became quieter for a moment. The adults began speaking in short, careful sentences. One parent may have held the child's arms, while the other tried to control his legs or head. The doctor positioned himself near the wound with the glue ready. Everyone seemed to know that the next few seconds mattered. The room became strangely quiet. It was not peaceful silence. It was the silence of several adults holding their breath and preparing for a difficult moment. Even though we could not see through the curtain, we could imagine what was happening. The child was lying on the table. His parents were holding him. The doctor was leaning close to his face. The glue was only inches from his eye. I remember feeling tense, even though I had nothing to do with the procedure. My own concussion and scan were temporarily forgotten. My mother and I were both listening. The doctor probably told the child to stay still. The parents may have whispered that everything was okay and it would be over soon. Then, the doctor started applying the glue. That was the exact moment everything went wrong. Without warning, the child began thrashing. He did not make a small movement. He reacted with his entire body. His arms and legs jerked, his head moved, and he fought against everyone holding him. At the same time, he lost control of his bowels and soiled himself. The smell reached the room almost immediately. The parents and medical staff were suddenly dealing with several problems at once. The child was screaming and moving. His diaper or clothing was full. The doctor was holding medical glue beside his face. And during the struggle, the glue went into the wrong place. The doctor glued the child's eye shut. For a second, nobody seemed to know what to say. The child continued screaming. The parents reacted in shock. The doctor's voice changed immediately. My mother and I looked at each other from our side of the curtain. We had heard enough to understand what had happened, even before anyone said it clearly. The situation was terrible, but it was also so sudden and strange that part of my brain struggled to accept it. The doctor had been trying to close a cut below the eye. The child moved at the worst possible moment. Now the cut still needed treatment. The child had soiled himself, and one of his eyes was sealed shut with medical glue. The tension in the room turned into confusion. The parents started asking questions. The doctor and nurses tried to calm everyone while also figuring out what to do next. I could hear people moving around quickly. Supplies were being opened or moved. Someone was probably trying to hold the child still again while another person examined the eye. The child had no idea why his eye would not open. He only knew that the adults had held him down. Something painful had happened near his face, and now he could not open one side properly. That probably made him panic even more. His screaming became louder. The parents sounded horrified. I could understand why. They had trusted the doctor to repair a cut, and within seconds the situation had become much worse. At the same time, I did not think the doctor had deliberately been careless. He had warned that the child needed to remain still, and the parents had tried to help. The child's movement was sudden and impossible to fully control. Still, knowing it was an accident did not make the result less frightening. Medical glue is designed to bond skin quickly. Once it reached the eyelid, it did exactly what it was made to do. The upper and lower eyelids stuck together. I remember wondering whether the glue had entered the eye itself or only sealed the lashes and eyelids. Nobody on our side of the curtain could see, and the medical staff did not explain the details loudly enough for us to know. I also wondered how they would fix it. Could they simply wash it away? Would they have to wait for it to loosen naturally? Would trying to pull the eye open damage the skin or lashes? I had no idea. At 15, I only knew that having an eye accidentally glued shut sounded horrible. My mother and I remained silent. It did not feel appropriate to laugh or make comments, even though the combination of events was almost impossible to process. A child had come in with a cut. He had started thrashing. He had soiled himself, and the doctor had glued his eye shut. It sounded like something from a dark comedy, but hearing the child cry made it impossible to forget that he was truly frightened and in pain. The staff continued working behind the curtain. They spoke more carefully now, probably trying to avoid making the situation worse. One person tried to calm the child. Another may have cleaned him or helped the parents deal with his clothing. The doctor examined the eye and explained what had happened. The parents kept asking whether his eye would be okay. I do not remember hearing a clear final answer. We were still waiting for my own treatment, and hospital staff eventually came to deal with my concussion. Our attention shifted when someone checked my condition or prepared me for the scan, but the sounds from the next section continued in the background. The child was still crying. His parents were still upset. The medical team was still dealing with the accidental glue. The entire room felt uncomfortable. The curtain made it even stranger because we could hear everything without being able to see what was happening. When people can see an emergency, they can understand the movements and expressions around it. When there is only sound, the mind creates its own images. Every cry seemed worse because we could not see whether the child was safe. Every quiet conversation sounded serious. Every movement of equipment made us wonder what procedure they were attempting next. I tried to focus on my own head injury, but I kept thinking about the boy. He had already been frightened by the blood. Then he had been held down. Then the eye was glued shut. For a toddler, the whole hospital visit must have felt like something terrifying and impossible to understand. He probably would not remember every detail later, but his parents certainly would. They might think about that moment every time they saw the scar below his eye. The doctor would probably remember it too. Medical workers perform the same procedures many times, and most go exactly as planned. But one sudden movement can create a mistake that stays in everyone's memory. I imagined the doctor replaying it afterward. Maybe he would think he should have protected the eye differently. Maybe he would wonder whether the child should have been sedated or wrapped more securely. Maybe he would blame himself even if he had followed normal procedure. Accidents during medical treatment can happen in less than a second, but the guilt can last much longer. The parents may also have blamed themselves. They had been asked to hold their child still. When he moved, they may have felt they had failed. But controlling a terrified toddler is extremely difficult, especially when you are trying not to hurt him. A child can twist with surprising strength when frightened. His movement did not mean the parents were careless. It meant he was scared and did not understand why people were touching a painful wound near his eye. That was the sad part. Every adult in the room was trying to help him. The doctor wanted to close the cut. The parents wanted to keep him safe. The nurses wanted the procedure completed without more pain. Yet their combined effort still ended with his eye glued shut. Hospitals are full of moments like that, where good intentions do not guarantee a good result. Before that night, I had thought of medical procedures as controlled events. Doctors had tools, training, and clear steps. Patients lay still, and the treatment happened. Watching or hearing what happened with that child showed me how much depends on the patient's movement, timing, and simple luck. A procedure can be routine until the exact second it is not. The doctor probably had only a tiny amount of glue exposed. The cut was only a short distance below the eye. The child moved at exactly the wrong angle. That was enough. I do not remember whether the medical staff eventually opened the eye before the family left. I do not know whether they used ointment, warm water, or simply waited for the glue to loosen. I also do not know whether the cut itself was successfully closed afterward. The story ends in my memory with the chaos behind the curtain. That uncertainty is part of why it stayed with me. I never got to see the final result. The family left our section at some point. Or perhaps my mother and I were moved before they were done. I only knew that the child had entered with a deep cut below his eye and, during treatment, had ended up with the eye glued shut. My own scan eventually happened. The doctors checked my head because of the concussion. I was fortunate that my injury was not the most serious thing happening in that room. I remember feeling strange about that. I had entered the emergency room focused completely on myself. I had a head injury, I was nervous, and I wanted answers. Then the child arrived, and suddenly my problem felt quieter. I was old enough to understand instructions. I could lie still. I could explain what hurt. I could control my body during a scan. The toddler could do none of those things. He reacted to fear in the only way he knew. His body fought, and everything went wrong. For years afterward, whenever someone mentioned medical glue, I thought about that room. I could see the hanging curtain in my mind. I could hear the adults becoming quiet. I could hear the child suddenly start moving. Then came the confusion, the crying, and the realization that his eye had been glued shut. The fact that he soiled himself at the same moment made the story almost unbelievable. It was as if every possible complication arrived at once. The parents had to deal with the wound, the eye, the smell, the clothing, and their frightened child. The doctor had to solve a new problem while still trying to complete the original treatment. The nurses had to calm everyone and bring more supplies. My mother and I could only sit behind a curtain and listen. I sometimes wondered what the parents told people afterward. Maybe the child's grandparents asked how the hospital visit went. Perhaps the parents said they closed the cut, but they also accidentally glued his eye shut. It is the kind of sentence that sounds like a joke, even when it is true. The child may have grown up hearing the story from his family. He might now have no memory of the event, and only a small scar under his eye. His parents may still tell him about the night he fought the doctor so hard that he soiled himself and ended up with one eye sealed closed. From a distance, years later, it may be funny to them. At the time, it was not funny at all. I remember the fear in the voices behind the curtain. I remember how quickly the room changed. Before the procedure, everyone was trying to stay calm. Afterward, nobody sounded calm. The doctor may have used a professional voice, but the speed of the movement around the bed showed that he knew something had gone badly wrong. The incident also made me think about how difficult pediatric care must be. Adults can usually understand why a painful procedure is necessary. They may hate it, but they can cooperate. A toddler only knows that something hurts, and people are holding him down. Even when the doctor is kind, the child may see him as a threat. Every movement becomes unpredictable. The safest procedure can become dangerous if the child twists at the wrong time. Medical staff need patience, skill, and sometimes extra help just to complete something simple. The parents are under pressure too. They want to comfort their child, but they are also being asked to hold him still while he cries. That can feel cruel, even when it is necessary. In this case, the parents did what they were told, but the child still broke free enough to move his face. I cannot imagine how guilty they may have felt in that moment. The story was also a lesson in how little privacy curtains actually provide. The hospital had pulled the sheet so we could not see the child's body or treatment. That protected him visually. But every word and sound came through. We heard his pain. We heard the instructions. We heard the accident. We knew private details about a family we had never met. The hospital did not have enough private rooms, so a hanging curtain had to serve as a wall. It was better than nothing, but not by much. My mother and I never spoke to the parents. We did not look around the curtain or try to see what was happening. That would have been wrong. We stayed on our side and gave them as much privacy as the room allowed. Still, we became unwilling witnesses. That happens often in busy emergency rooms. You learn things about strangers because their bed is only a few feet away. You hear diagnoses, family arguments, cries of pain, and medical instructions. Then you leave and never see those people again. Their worst day becomes one of your memories. The boy and his family probably never knew that the teenager with a concussion and his mother heard the whole thing. To them, we were just other patients behind a curtain. To me, they became part of a story I never forgot. The event was not frightening in the same way as a violent attack or a near-death experience. Nobody died. As far as I know, the child's eye was not permanently damaged, but the combination of pain, panic, and medical error made it disturbing. It showed how quickly control can disappear, even in a hospital surrounded by trained people. One moment, the doctor was preparing to close a cut. The next, the child was thrashing. His parents were struggling to hold him. He had soiled himself, and one eye was glued shut. There was no time for anyone to prevent it once the movement began. That was the part that felt almost like horror. It was not a monster or ghost. It was the sudden knowledge that something routine had gone wrong, and everyone in the room had to react before it became worse. I still remember the exact feeling in the air before it happened. The room had become quiet. The adults were concentrating. The child was being held still. Even behind the curtain, we could feel the tension. Then everything exploded into noise. That sudden change made the moment unforgettable. I have had many hospital experiences since then, and I know medical staff deal with situations far worse than this every day. But this one remains one of the strangest. Maybe it is because I was young. Maybe it is because I could hear everything but see nothing. Maybe it is because the final result was so unexpected. Whatever the reason, I still think about that little boy whenever someone mentions a cut near the eye. I hope the glue was removed safely. I hope his eye was fine. I hope the wound healed without a serious scar. I hope his parents eventually learned to laugh about the story. At the time, though, there was nothing funny about hearing him scream from behind that curtain. I had gone to the emergency room because of a concussion and was waiting to have my head scanned. The boy came in because of a deep cut below his eye. The doctor decided to seal it with glue. His parents held him down because he was too young and frightened to stay still. For a few seconds, the room became silent. Then the child started thrashing, soiled himself, and moved his face at exactly the wrong moment. The doctor glued his eyes shut. That is the whole story. It may not be true horror, but hearing it happen from only a few feet away was one of the creepiest and most uncomfortable hospital moments of my life. About a year ago, my 12-year-old daughter broke her arm halfway through class. It happened at around 1:30 in the afternoon. I do not remember every detail of how the school first contacted me, but I remember the urgency in the message and how quickly my mind started moving once I understood that she was hurt. She was in serious pain, and I needed to decide where to take her. There were 3 emergency rooms nearby. 2 were only about a 5-minute drive away, while the third was closer to 10 minutes from us. Under normal conditions, that difference would not matter much. When your child is crying from a broken arm, however, every minute feels important. The first emergency room had a terrible reputation. I had heard enough bad stories about it that I did not want to risk taking my daughter there. Maybe some people had received good care, but this was my child, and she was in severe pain. I did not want to spend the whole visit wondering whether I had made a mistake by choosing a hospital I already did not trust. So the first hospital was immediately rejected. The third emergency room had a very good reputation. I knew people who had gone there and been treated well. It was the hospital I trusted most, but it was the farthest away. The second hospital was close, and I did not know much about it. I had not heard many complaints, but I had not heard much praise either. At that moment, it seemed like the reasonable middle choice. It was nearby, and I assumed any emergency room should be able to examine a broken arm, take an X-ray, control the pain, and place it in a temporary cast. I chose the second hospital. That was the wrong decision. My daughter was in so much pain that she could barely control herself. She was crying loudly, almost wailing. I gave her the last of the children's Tylenol we had with us, hoping it would begin working during the drive. She was 12 years old and weighed around 80 pounds, but she was hurting too badly to walk normally. I carried her into the hospital like she was a small child. That was not easy. She was not heavy for her age, but carrying an 80-pound child while trying to protect an injured arm is difficult. I had to keep her body close to mine without allowing her arm to move or strike anything. She cried the entire way through the entrance. The moment we entered the emergency room, the nurse at the front desk shouted at me to keep her quiet. She did not calmly ask whether my daughter needed help. She did not ask what had happened or how long she had been in pain. She yelled, "Keep her quiet." I was shocked. My daughter was not making noise because she was bored, rude, or badly behaved. She was crying because her arm was broken. I told the nurse exactly that. I explained that she had hurt her arm, was in severe pain, and that the Tylenol had not started working yet. The nurse stood up, opened the door to one of the examination rooms, and told me the doctor would be in shortly. Then she closed the curtain and the door behind us. At first, I thought perhaps her rude tone was caused by stress and that we would still receive quick treatment. The emergency room did not look very crowded, and my daughter's pain was obvious. I sat beside her and tried to help her calm down. The room was small and basic. There was an examination bed, a chair, and the usual medical equipment on the walls. My daughter remained on the bed, holding her injured arm as still as she could. The Tylenol slowly began to take the edge off the pain, but she was still crying quietly. 15 or 20 minutes passed. Nobody came in. I tried to remain patient because emergency rooms have to deal with people according to how serious their conditions are. Someone with chest pain or a life-threatening injury should obviously be treated before a broken arm. But there was no sign of anyone checking on us. My daughter was still frightened and hurting, so I went back to the front desk and asked how much longer it would be before the doctor came in. The same nurse told me he would be there soon. Then she handed me another dose of Tylenol and told me to give it to my daughter. I explained that my daughter had already taken the maximum allowed dose when we arrived. I was not going to give her more than the recommended amount simply because the hospital had prepared another dose. The nurse told me that the medicine had already been billed. According to her, my choices were to throw it away or take it with me. I could not believe that was her response. The important question should have been whether it was medically safe for my daughter to take more. Instead, the nurse seemed more concerned about the fact that the hospital had already added the medication to the bill. I kept the medicine, but did not give it to my daughter. The nurse then asked for my insurance card and wanted to know how I planned to pay the copay. Again, we still had not seen a doctor. My daughter had not been examined. Nobody had touched her arm, checked her circulation, taken an X-ray, or confirmed the injury. But the hospital was already focused on payment. I gave the nurse my insurance card and credit card. While she processed them, I returned to the room to stay with my daughter. A little while later, the nurse told me the credit card had been declined. That did not make sense. I knew there was enough money available, and I had used the card without any problem before arriving at the hospital. I called my credit union and asked what had happened. They checked the attempted transaction and told me the wrong PIN had been entered. Their system automatically declined the transaction when an incorrect PIN was used. That meant the problem was not with my account or my card. The nurse had entered the wrong number. I explained this to her and asked her to run the card again. She refused. She demanded cash instead. I told her I did not carry $200 in cash. Most people do not walk around with that much money, especially when they are rushing a crying child to an emergency room. The nurse continued insisting that I had to pay cash because the card had been declined. I repeated what the credit union had told me. The transaction failed only because the wrong PIN was entered. The card itself was fine. She became more aggressive and threatened to call security if I did not pay. At that point, I was trying to deal with two problems at once. My daughter was alone in the room with a broken arm, waiting for medical care. At the front desk, I was arguing with a nurse who seemed more interested in the copay than in the injured child. I did not want security involved. I had done nothing wrong, but I also did not want the situation to become louder or more frightening for my daughter. After a great deal of complaining and arguing, the nurse finally agreed to run the card again. This time, the transaction went through. There had never been anything wrong with the card. She had simply entered the information incorrectly the first time and then treated me as if I were refusing to pay. I returned to the room angry, but tried not to show it too much in front of my daughter. She was already upset, and I did not want her to believe we were in danger or that the hospital might refuse to treat her. Time continued passing. By around 2:45, we had been there for more than an hour. I looked out of the room and did not see anyone nearby. The hallway seemed almost empty. I walked a short distance and eventually saw a janitor. I asked him if he knew where the doctors or nurses were. He did not. That was a strange answer to receive inside an emergency room. I was not expecting the janitor to manage the medical staff, but the fact that he was the only employee I could find made the whole place feel deserted. I returned to the room and sat beside my daughter again. Her pain had become less extreme, probably because the Tylenol had started working and because she had been keeping the arm still. but she was still crying and clearly uncomfortable. At around 3 o'clock, a different nurse entered the room. She was not the same rude nurse from the front desk. She asked how things were going. I tried to remain polite. I told her we had been in the hospital for about an hour and a half, and that she was the first medical person who had entered the room since we arrived. She looked surprised and apologized. She promised that someone would deal with us immediately. I appreciated her attitude. She at least seemed to understand that leaving an injured child alone for that long was unacceptable. Still, another 30 minutes passed. At around 3:30, a doctor finally entered. By then, we had been in the emergency room for about 2 hours. The doctor examined my daughter's arm and ordered an X-ray. During the examination, he grabbed her wrist and twisted it. She screamed. I could not understand why he moved the injured arm that way without warning or greater care. Her pain had finally become more manageable, and one sudden movement brought it back immediately. I reacted with shock and anger. The doctor said he thought the arm might be broken. That was not surprising. We had been saying from the beginning that it appeared broken. My daughter had severe pain and could not properly use the arm. I had expected him to examine her, but I did not expect him to twist the wrist hard enough to make her scream before imaging had been done. After that, we waited again. It was not until around 4:30 that the X-ray technician came to get us. He took my daughter to the imaging room and placed her arm in several positions to take the pictures. X-rays can be painful when a bone is broken because the technician needs different angles. The patient may have to move or hold the injured arm in positions that hurt. The technician took several images and then brought us back to the room. We waited again. At around 5 o'clock, the doctor returned. He said he could not tell anything from the X-rays. That response was difficult to understand. The whole reason for ordering the X-rays was to determine whether the arm was broken and where the injury was located. After hours of waiting, the doctor still could not give us an answer. He did not clearly explain whether the images were poor, whether the break was difficult to see, or whether a specialist needed to review them. He simply said he could not tell. Then he left again. By around 6 o'clock, a nurse finally returned. We had now been at the hospital for roughly 4.5 hours. The nurse placed my daughter's arm in a temporary sling or cast. It was meant to keep the arm still until she could see a specialist. They gave us a referral and sent us home. We still did not have a clear explanation from the emergency room. We knew the arm was injured badly enough to require support, but the doctor had not clearly confirmed the type of break. The entire visit felt like a long series of delays, rude comments, payment demands, and incomplete answers. My daughter entered the hospital screaming in pain. The first nurse told me to keep her quiet. We waited alone in a room. The nurse tried to give her more Tylenol even though she had already reached the maximum dose. She focused on billing the medication and collecting the copay before anyone examined the injury. She entered the wrong PIN for my card and then threatened to call security when I did not have $200 in cash. The doctor did not arrive for about 2 hours. He twisted the injured wrist and caused my daughter to scream again. The X-rays took another hour. Then he said he could not tell what they showed. Finally, after more waiting, someone placed the arm in temporary support and referred us elsewhere. The specialist was completely different. From the moment we met him, he was kind, professional, and helpful. He treated my daughter gently and listened to us. He properly examined the arm and explained what was happening. He did not make her feel as though her pain was an inconvenience. The healing process went very well under his care. My daughter recovered, and the specialist made the whole experience much easier than it could have been. That proved something important to me. The problem at the emergency room was not that treating a broken arm was impossible, or that every medical professional would behave the same way. A good doctor could handle the situation with patience, skill, and respect. The specialist did exactly that. For a while, I thought the terrible emergency room visit was finally behind us. Then, around 3 months later, we received a letter from a collection agency. The letter said we still owed the hospital $15. I was confused because we had paid the copay while we were still in the emergency room. I remembered the argument about the credit card very clearly. The nurse had eventually run the card correctly, and the payment had gone through. I went back to the hospital to ask why they had sent an unpaid balance to collections. They told me the $15 was for the Tylenol from the pharmacy. It was the same medicine the nurse had tried to give me, even though I had explained that my daughter had already taken the maximum safe dose. She had told me the medication was already billed, so I could either throw it away or take it. Now, 3 months later, that medicine had created a collection account. Nobody from the hospital had contacted me about the $15. I had not received a clear bill or warning telling me that a small balance remained. Instead, they waited 90 days and automatically sent it to collections. That collection notice appeared on our credit report. Before this, our credit history had been flawless. A $15 hospital charge, connected to medicine my daughter could not safely take at the time, had now damaged it. I asked why nobody had contacted me for payment before sending it to a collection agency. I would have paid $15 immediately if I had known it was owed. There was no reason to risk damage to our credit over such a small amount. The response I received was, "Not my department." That answer perfectly matched the entire hospital experience. Nobody seemed responsible for anything. The rude nurse was not responsible for entering the wrong PIN. The staff were not responsible for leaving us alone for hours. The doctor was not responsible for giving us a clear diagnosis. The billing department was not responsible for contacting us before sending $15 to collections. Every problem belonged to someone else. The emergency room had treated my daughter as though her pain was a disturbance. Then, the billing system treated us as though we were refusing to pay. The truth was that I had carried my 12-year-old daughter into the hospital because she could not walk comfortably on her own. She had been crying so loudly because her arm was broken. Instead of compassion, the first thing we received was an order to keep her quiet. That moment has stayed with me more than almost anything else. Children do not always handle pain silently. Adults do not always handle it silently either. My daughter was frightened, confused, and hurting. She had broken a bone during class, been taken out of school, given medication, carried into an unfamiliar hospital, and placed in a room without knowing what would happen next. Crying was a normal response. A nurse should understand that better than most people. Even if the noise was difficult for staff or other patients, there were kinder ways to respond. She could have said, "Let's get her into a room." She could have asked where it hurt. She could have offered an ice pack or checked whether the arm was supported. Instead, she yelled at me to control the sound. That set the tone for everything that followed. The concern about medication also bothered me. The nurse handed me Tylenol without first carefully checking what my daughter had already taken. I told her she had received the maximum dose. If I had simply followed the instruction without thinking, I could have given my daughter too much. I do not know whether the extra amount would have caused harm, but parents are told for good reason to follow the dosing instructions on children's medicine. The nurse's response was not to check the timing or amount. She said the dose had already been billed. That made the hospital's priorities seem completely wrong. The money was treated as settled before the medical question was. Then there was the payment problem. I understand that hospitals need insurance information and co-pays. Medical care is expensive. and billing is part of the system. But payment should not become an argument while a child is waiting with a broken arm. The nurse made a mistake while entering my PIN. Instead of simply trying again, she demanded cash and threatened security. Her mistake became my problem. I was forced to call my credit union from the hospital and prove that the account was fine. Even after I had proof, she resisted running the card again. That made me feel trapped. I had no intention of leaving without paying. I had provided both the insurance card and credit card. I was cooperating. But she treated me as if I were trying to avoid the bill. At the same time, my daughter was waiting alone, or nearly alone, in the room. Every minute spent arguing about payment was a minute I was not beside her. The lack of visible staff made the situation even stranger. At 2:45, I looked into the hallway and could not find a doctor or nurse. The only person I saw was a janitor. Emergency rooms can become quiet for short periods because staff are busy in other rooms, but as a parent, it was alarming. I had no idea whether anyone remembered we were there. The second nurse's surprise at 3 o'clock suggested that perhaps we had actually been forgotten. She apologized and promised immediate action, but the doctor still did not arrive until 30 minutes later. By then, the pain had already been going on for hours. The doctor twisting the wrist was another moment that remained with both of us. Perhaps he needed to test movement or locate the source of pain. I understand that examining an injured arm may cause discomfort, but there is a difference between a careful examination and suddenly twisting a child's wrist hard enough to make her scream. He then said he thought it might be broken, as though that possibility had not already been obvious. The X-ray process was also slow, and the final response was unsatisfying. If the doctor could not read the images, he should have explained why. Perhaps a radiologist needed to review them. Maybe the angle was poor or the break was subtle. An explanation would have helped. Instead, we were left with uncertainty. The hospital did eventually protect the arm with a temporary sling or cast, which was better than sending us home with nothing. But the treatment felt like the minimum possible response after a very long wait. The specialist showed us how much better the experience could have been. He treated my daughter like a person. He respected her pain. He explained the injury. He provided the right care and followed the healing process. She recovered well, which was the most important outcome. I was deeply grateful for that. Still, a good final result does not erase the unnecessary stress that happened before it. 3 months later, the collection letter opened the entire experience again. $15 may sound like a small amount, and financially it was. The damage was not about whether I could afford to pay it. The problem was that nobody told me it remained unpaid. The hospital had already made payment the center of our visit. They had demanded the co-pay before my daughter was properly examined. They had argued about my credit card and threatened security. After all that, they still failed to clearly collect or notify me about a $15 pharmacy charge. Then, they sent it to collections. That felt careless and unfair. A hospital should understand that collection reports can affect a family's ability to borrow money, rent a home, finance a vehicle, or manage other important parts of life. Sending a tiny balance to collections without making a reasonable effort to contact the patient can create damage far greater than the amount owed. When I asked for an explanation, "Not my department" was all I received. That sentence showed a complete lack of ownership. It did not matter which department had made the decision. I was standing inside the same hospital, asking why it happened. Someone should have been willing to investigate. Someone should have said, "Let me look into it." Instead, the problem was passed away. Looking back, I still regret choosing the second emergency room. The third hospital was only about 5 minutes farther away, At the time, those extra minutes felt important because my daughter was in pain. In the end, choosing the closer hospital cost us hours of poor treatment, stress, and a later billing problem. It is impossible to know exactly what the third hospital would have done. Maybe it would also have been busy. Perhaps we would still have waited. But based on its reputation and my later experience with the specialist, I believe we would have been treated with more care. The decision felt simple when I made it. Hospital 1 had a bad reputation. Hospital 3 was farther away. Hospital 2 was close and unknown. I chose the unknown option. I learned that no information does not always mean no problems. My daughter healed, and that is what matters most. She received excellent care from the specialist, and her arm recovered properly. But I will never forget carrying her through those doors while she cried. I will never forget the nurse shouting, "Keep her quiet." I will never forget being handed extra Tylenol because it had already been billed. I will never forget calling my credit union while my injured child waited in another room. I will never forget being threatened with security because I did not carry $200 in cash. I will never forget walking through an empty-looking hallway and asking a janitor where the medical staff had gone. I will never forget the doctor twisting her wrist and making her scream. I will never forget waiting hours for an X-ray, only to be told the doctor could not see anything clearly. And I will never forget getting a collection notice for $15 months later because of medicine my daughter did not even need at that moment. The entire experience felt like a lesson in how badly a hospital can handle both care and communication. The building had doctors, nurses, equipment, an X-ray room, a pharmacy, and a billing department. What it seemed to lack was coordination and basic compassion. My daughter was treated eventually. The arm was supported. The specialist completed the real care. But at the emergency room, every step felt harder than it needed to be. This happened about a year ago, and I still think about how different the afternoon might have been if I had driven 5 more minutes to the hospital I already trusted. Sometimes the closest emergency room is not the fastest way to get help. Sometimes the place that saves a few minutes on the road costs hours once you walk through the door. I recently read a news story about a small group of Ukrainian soldiers who found themselves surrounded by a mercenary force believed to be connected to Belarus. I do not know how much of the account was independently confirmed, and some of the details came from the surviving soldiers themselves, but the description of the battle was so intense that it stayed in my mind long after I finished reading. According to the story, there were only around 6 Ukrainian fighters in the position by the time the situation became truly desperate. They had machine guns, ammunition, and a limited number of grenades, but they did not have the kind of heavy weapons or large support force that would normally be needed to fight off a much bigger attack. They were in a position that had become almost completely surrounded. I imagined what that must have felt like. In a normal battle, soldiers may still have a road behind them, another unit nearby, or some hope that help will arrive. These men apparently had very little of that. They knew an enemy force was around them, and they knew the attack could begin again at any moment. The mercenary group reportedly used a tactic that sounded both simple and horrifying. Instead of sending their best trained fighters forward first, they sent waves of less experienced recruits directly at the Ukrainian position. The first groups did not seem to move with much care. They did not slowly approach, take cover, or use the kind of controlled movement people might expect from trained soldiers. They simply charged. The Ukrainian fighters opened fire. The first wave was cut down. Then another wave came. The soldiers defending the position kept firing their machine guns, trying to stop the attackers before they reached them. Bodies began falling in front of the position, but the attacks did not stop. More men were sent forward. According to the account, some of the new attackers ran directly over the bodies of those who had already been killed. They continued moving even as people in front of them were being shot. That was the detail that made the story sound almost unreal. The Ukrainian soldier who described it compared the scene to something from World War Z. In that film, infected people rush forward in huge numbers without caring about their own safety. They climb over one another and continue moving no matter how many fall. The real-life scene apparently felt similar. Men kept coming in waves. They moved over piles of bodies. They continued running toward the Ukrainian position, even when it was obvious that the people ahead of them were being killed. The article suggested that some of the recruits may have been under the influence of drugs, although I do not know whether that was ever proven. It may have been the soldiers' explanation for behavior that seemed impossible to understand. From the defenders' point of view, the attackers did not appear to be acting normally. They showed little fear and seemed willing to run directly into heavy machine gun fire. That does not necessarily mean drugs were involved. People in combat can behave in strange ways because of fear, orders, pressure from commanders, lack of training, or the belief that retreating will lead to punishment. Still, the soldiers who witnessed it clearly believed something unusual was happening. The recruits were described as almost disposable. The suspected tactic was to use these men to drain the Ukrainians' ammunition. The first waves were not expected to win. Their purpose may have been to force the defenders to fire as many rounds as possible. Machine guns can create a powerful defense, but only while ammunition remains. Every burst removes more rounds from the supply. If the attacking force has enough men to keep charging, the defenders may eventually run low. Once that happens, better trained soldiers can move forward against a position that has lost most of its ability to fight back. The idea is horrifying because it treats human beings like ammunition. The inexperienced recruits are sent forward knowing that many of them will die. Their lives are used to reduce the enemy's bullets. Then the experienced fighters are sent in after the defenders have been weakened. According to the story, that appeared to be what was happening. The Ukrainian soldiers kept firing. They had no real alternative. If they stopped, the charging men might reach their position. Once the attackers got close enough, the defenders could be overwhelmed in hand-to-hand fighting or killed with grenades and small arms. So they fired into each wave. The machine guns would have been deafening. In a confined defensive position, the sound of repeated automatic fire can become overwhelming. The air fills with smoke, dust, and the smell of hot metal and explosives. The soldiers would have been shouting to one another, trying to communicate over the weapons. They needed to watch several directions at once because they were surrounded or nearly surrounded. One man might be firing while another changed ammunition belts or magazines. Someone else had to watch the side of the position to make sure the enemy was not moving around them. They could not focus only on the men charging from the front. Every movement in the distance could be another group trying to close in. The article did not give every detail of the battlefield, but I imagined a position that was becoming smaller and more dangerous with every attack. The bodies of the first attackers remained in front of them. Then more bodies were added. The ground became difficult to move across. The next waves had to step over or on the dead. That image is difficult to forget. These were men who may have trained together, traveled together, or spoken only minutes earlier. Now the survivors were being ordered to run over them and continue toward the same gunfire. There was no time to stop or help anyone. Anyone who slowed down could be shot. Anyone who turned around might face punishment from their own side. The battle continued until the Ukrainian fighters began running low on ammunition. At first, they may have believed they had enough. A full supply can feel reassuring before a battle begins. Boxes of ammunition, loaded magazines, and belts of rounds seem like they could last a long time. But automatic weapons use ammunition incredibly quickly. A machine gun can fire hundreds of rounds in a short period. Even controlled bursts consume more ammunition than people expect. When wave after wave keeps approaching, the supply disappears. The defenders may have started counting what remained. One box left, a few magazines, a final belt for the machine gun. Every shot had to matter. They could no longer fire long bursts at every movement. They needed to wait until attackers came closer and make each round more effective. That waiting would have been terrifying. Firing early gives a soldier the feeling of pushing the enemy back. Waiting saves ammunition, but it also allows the enemy to come nearer. The attackers would look larger with every second. The defenders could see faces, weapons, and movement more clearly. Eventually, according to the account, the Ukrainian soldiers used almost all of their ammunition. Their machine guns were no longer enough to hold the position. They were left mainly with grenades. That meant the enemy had succeeded in at least part of the suspected plan. The waves of recruits had absorbed the bullets. Now the defenders were weak. This was reportedly the stage when the more experienced mercenary fighters were expected to move forward. These men would not charge carelessly in the same way. They would use cover, watch the Ukrainian position, and wait for the right moment. They knew the defenders had been firing for a long time. They could assume the ammunition supply was nearly gone. The first waves had done the dangerous work for them. From the Ukrainian soldiers' perspective, the battle had changed. They were no longer trying to defeat each wave. They were trying to survive long enough to escape. Grenades can be powerful at close range, but they are not a replacement for machine gun ammunition. A soldier can carry only a limited number. Once thrown, each grenade is gone. They also require the enemy to come close enough for the throw to be effective. That meant the Ukrainians were approaching the final stage of the defense. They could wait for the experienced fighters to reach them and probably die, or they could attempt to retreat through an area partly controlled by the enemy. Neither choice was safe. Retreating from a surrounded position is extremely dangerous. The soldiers must leave whatever protection they have and move through open or uncertain ground. They may not know where enemy soldiers are hiding. They may be fired on from behind. If one person is injured, the others must decide whether to stop and help or continue moving. A small group also has little ability to cover every direction, yet remaining in place may have meant certain death. The surviving soldiers made the decision to withdraw. The story said that somehow all 6 or so men survived. I found that part almost as unbelievable as the waves of attackers. They had been surrounded. They had fought until they were down to grenades. A larger and more experienced enemy force was preparing to finish them. Despite that, they managed to leave the position alive. The article did not explain every movement of the retreat, but it must have required a mix of planning, courage, and luck. Perhaps they used grenades to force the enemy to take cover. Maybe smoke, darkness, damaged ground, or confusion helped hide their movement. They may have known a narrow path through the area that the enemy had not fully closed. One soldier may have covered the others while they moved. Then the group could have changed positions and covered him in return. Whatever they did, it worked. They escaped from a position that appeared impossible to leave. I kept thinking about what those men must have felt once they reached safety. During the battle, there would have been no time to fully understand what they were seeing. They had to fire, reload, watch the enemy, and communicate. Only afterward could their minds begin processing the scene. They had watched men run directly into machine gun fire. They had seen attackers continue over piles of bodies. They had used nearly every round they carried. They had prepared to fight with only grenades. Then they had run from a position where they expected to be killed. Survival does not mean they left the experience behind. Memories like that can remain for years. The sound of automatic fire, the sight of the approaching waves, and the fear of running out of ammunition may return in dreams or quiet moments. A person can escape physically while part of the mind remains on the battlefield. The story also made me think about the recruits who were sent forward. It would be easy to describe them only as the enemy, but the tactic described in the article suggested that they were also being used by their own commanders. Some may have been poorly trained. Some may have been forced or pressured into service. Others may have joined for money, ideology, or the promise of a better life. Whatever brought them there, they were sent into a position where machine guns were already cutting down the men ahead of them. If drugs were involved, as the account suggested, that would make the situation even darker. Giving someone a substance to reduce fear or increase aggression before sending them into deadly fire would show complete disregard for that person's life. But even without drugs, commanders can create the same result through threats, discipline, or lies. The recruits may have been told that the Ukrainian position was weak. They may have believed the defenders were already out of ammunition. They may not have known how many men had died in the previous wave until they reached the bodies. At that point, it may have been too late to turn around. The tactic depends on numbers and obedience. One group dies. Another group is ordered forward. The defenders fire. Their ammunition falls. The process continues until the position can no longer resist. It is brutal, but it has appeared in different forms throughout military history. Armies have often used poorly trained soldiers to test enemy positions, reveal firing locations, clear dangerous areas, or simply exhaust the defenders. Modern weapons make such tactics even more deadly. A machine gun can kill many people in seconds, but it still has a limited supply of ammunition. A commander willing to lose enough men can sometimes use that limitation. That is what made the story so disturbing. It was not only about a fierce battle, it was about people being deliberately spent. The recruits became part of a calculation. How many men would it take to empty the Ukrainian machine guns? How many bodies could be exchanged for one defensive position? Once the numbers were considered acceptable, the attack continued. The comparison to World War Z made sense visually, but there was an important difference. In the film, the attackers are not fully human in the normal sense. They do not think, fear, or understand death. In the real story, every person running forward was a human being. They had families, memories, and lives before the battle. They may have felt fear even if they kept moving. The fact that they continued over the bodies did not mean they had no emotions. It may have meant they believed stopping was impossible. The Ukrainian soldiers also had no real choice. They could not lower their weapons out of sympathy. The men running toward them were armed and trying to kill them. If the defenders stopped firing, they would die. War forces people into situations where survival depends on killing someone who may also be trapped. That is one reason the story remained with me. It was easy to admire the 6 Ukrainian soldiers for surviving, but the full scene was not simple or heroic. It was horrifying on every side. The defenders had to fire until their ammunition was almost gone. The recruits were sent into certain or near certain death. The experienced fighters waited behind them for the chance to finish the battle. Commanders watched the process as a military tactic. The people actually on the ground paid the price. I also wondered how accurate the account was. Battle stories can become confused because soldiers remember events while under extreme stress. Numbers may be estimated. The identity of an enemy unit may not be completely clear. Reports about drug use may come from behavior that looked unnatural rather than from medical evidence. The article may have simplified a complicated battle into a shorter and more dramatic story. Still, even allowing for uncertainty, the central description seemed possible. A small group was nearly surrounded. They faced repeated attacks. Their ammunition became dangerously low. They retreated and survived. The soldier's description of attackers continuing over the dead showed how terrifying the event felt to those inside it. Whether every detail was exact or not, the fear was real. I imagined being one of those 6 men. At first, I would hear movement in the distance and prepare the machine gun. Then the first wave would appear. I would fire and see men fall. Before I had time to think, another group would come. The barrel would become hot. The ammunition supply would become smaller. Someone beside me might shout that more attackers were coming from another direction. I would begin wondering whether help was on the way. Then I would realize no help was coming soon enough. Each time I loaded another belt or magazine, I would know there were fewer left. Eventually, I would reach for ammunition and find almost nothing. At that moment, the machine gun that had protected me would become a heavy piece of metal. The grenades would be the final defense. I would look at the other 5 men and know that everyone was thinking the same thing. We either leave now or die here. Then the retreat would begin. Every shadow could hide an enemy. Every open area could be covered by a rifle. Every sound behind us could mean pursuit. The group would have to keep moving despite exhaustion. After hours of firing, breathing smoke, and operating under stress, their bodies would already be tired. They may have been thirsty, injured, or almost unable to hear because of the gunfire. Still, they escaped. That survival was extraordinary. It may have depended on the enemy believing the position was still occupied. The Ukrainians could have thrown grenades from different points to create confusion. They might have moved during a short pause between waves. Perhaps the more experienced mercenaries were waiting for orders and did not expect a sudden retreat. Small decisions made in a few seconds may have saved all of them. I wondered whether they felt relief immediately or only later. Sometimes people in extreme danger do not feel safe even after reaching friendly lines. Their bodies remain ready to fight. They may continue shaking, watching behind them, and expecting gunfire. Only after someone gives them water, checks their injuries, and tells them they are safe does the fear fully arrive. One of them may have looked around and counted the others. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Everyone made it. That moment must have been powerful. They had been down to grenades and somehow escaped without leaving one of their own behind. The article described the story as a remarkable survival, and I could understand why. It also showed how important ammunition and supply lines are in war. People often focus on weapons themselves. A machine gun looks powerful, and it is, but without ammunition, it is useless. A small defensive group can fight effectively only as long as supplies last. The mercenary force reportedly understood that and attacked the ammunition instead of the position. They used human waves to make the Ukrainians fire. Once the bullets were gone, the stronger fighters could move in. That is a cold and terrible kind of strategy. The Ukrainian soldiers survived because they recognized what was happening before the final attack closed around them. If they had waited a little longer, they may not have had enough grenades or space to escape. The story ended without giving many details about the men afterward. It did not say whether they returned to combat, received awards, or were injured during the retreat. Perhaps that is why it felt so real. There was no perfect ending. They simply survived a terrible situation and told someone what they had seen. I read it and kept thinking about the image of people running over the dead. That image contains nearly everything awful about war. Fear, obedience, violence, waste, and survival are all there. The recruits kept coming because someone ordered them forward. The Ukrainians kept firing because stopping meant death. The bodies became part of the ground. Then, the more experienced fighters prepared to attack after the ammunition was gone. There was no clean victory in that scene. Only people trying to survive decisions made by others. The story may not have been presented as a horror story, but it felt like one to me. Horror does not always require ghosts, monsters, or supernatural events. Sometimes it is a group of tired soldiers watching another wave of men run toward them after the previous wave has already died. Sometimes it is realizing the enemy commanders are willing to sacrifice as many people as needed to empty your weapons. Sometimes it is reaching for another magazine and finding none. Sometimes it is holding a grenade and knowing that it may be the final weapon you have. The 6 Ukrainian fighters apparently reached that point. They were almost surrounded. Their machine guns were becoming useless because the ammunition was gone. The experienced enemy fighters were preparing to move forward. The defenders had only a few grenades and a narrow chance to escape. Somehow, they took that chance. Somehow, all of them survived. I found the story interesting because it sounded almost impossible, but also because it showed the kind of battle that does not fit neatly into simple ideas about courage or victory. The Ukrainian soldiers were brave, but they were also probably terrified. The recruits charging them may have looked fearless, but many may have been trapped, drugged, threatened, or too poorly trained to understand what was happening. The experienced mercenaries may have viewed the first waves only as a tool. Everyone was part of a system that treated lives as numbers. The surviving soldiers compared it to a scene from a film because ordinary words were probably not enough. How else do you explain watching men continue forward over the bodies of their friends? How do you explain firing until the weapon has almost nothing left? How do you explain escaping with only grenades when a larger force is nearly closed around you? The comparison to World War Z gave people an image they could understand. But unlike a film, there was no director, no special effect, and no one calling for the scene to stop. The bodies were real. The fear was real. The ammunition did run out. And the 6 men who survived had to carry the memory with them. That was the part I could not stop thinking about after reading the story. Before the next witness tells their story, take a moment to subscribe to Nachtmeier Witness. This channel is for the late hours, when sleep is close, but the mind is still awake enough to notice every sound in the room. New true stories arrive here for anyone drawn to strange encounters, uneasy memories, and nights that never felt normal again. Leave a like if the stories have pulled you in so far. Now, let's return to the darkness. I still remember the day our school went into lockdown because of a possible shooting. No shots were ever fired, and the person was caught before anyone was physically hurt, but the fear of waiting in that classroom was real. At the time, we did not know how the situation would end. We only knew that someone dangerous might be somewhere inside or near the school, and we had no way to tell how close they were to us. The day had started normally. There was nothing unusual about the morning that warned us what was coming. Students were talking, teachers were going through lessons, and everyone was thinking about the usual things. Some people were worried about assignments or tests. Others were waiting for lunch or looking forward to going home. School can feel like one of the safest and most predictable places in the world. Every day follows a schedule. Bells ring at the same times. Students move through the same hallways. Teachers stand in the same classrooms. Even when school feels boring, that routine creates a sense of safety. Then, without warning, everything changed. An announcement came through the speaker, or someone told our teacher that the school needed to lock down. I do not remember every exact word. What I remember is the sudden change in the room. The teacher stopped teaching. The students stopped talking. People looked at one another, trying to understand whether this was a drill or something real. Schools often practice lockdown drills. During those drills, teachers close and lock the doors, turn off the lights, and move students away from the windows. Everyone is told to stay quiet until the drill ends. A drill can feel uncomfortable, but deep down, you know there is no real danger. You know that after a few minutes, someone will announce that the drill is over and the lesson will continue. This did not feel like a drill. There was something in the teacher's face and voice that made the situation seem serious. The door was locked. The lights were turned off. We moved away from the entrance and windows. Then, we hid together. The classroom that had felt normal only moments earlier suddenly felt too open and too small at the same time. Every window looked like a possible danger. The locked door seemed much thinner than it had before. We gathered in the safest area we could find. Some students crouched beneath desks or sat close to the wall. Others moved into a corner where they could not be easily seen from the doorway. Everyone tried to stay silent. I remember wanting to cry. The fear came so quickly that I could feel it taking over my whole body. My chest felt tight, and my thoughts began moving faster than I could control. I wanted to make noise. I wanted to ask the teacher what was happening. I wanted someone to tell me it was going to be okay, but we had been told to remain quiet. If there really was a shooter somewhere in the school, even a small sound could reveal that people were inside the room. So I held everything in. I sat with the rest of my class and tried not to cry loudly. Some people were shaking. Others stared at the floor. A few students held their phones, probably trying to message their parents or find out what was happening. Nobody had reliable information. Rumors started moving through messages almost immediately. Someone said there was a gun. Someone else said the person had entered the building. Another student may have heard that police were already inside. Nobody knew what was true. That was one of the most frightening parts. When people have no information, the mind creates its own possibilities. Every sound in the hallway became a threat. Footsteps might be a police officer, a teacher, or the person everyone was hiding from. A door closing somewhere in the building sounded much louder than usual. Even ordinary noises from pipes, ventilation, or furniture seemed dangerous. We listened for gunshots. That is the thought that has stayed with me most clearly. We were sitting in silence, waiting to hear the sound that would confirm our worst fear. No shots had been fired, but we did not know that yet. Every second that passed without a gunshot felt like a small relief, but it did not make us feel safe. We knew the sound could come at any time. I looked around at my classmates and wondered what they were thinking. These were people I saw every day. Some were close friends. Others were only students I happened to share a class with. In that moment, none of those differences mattered. We were all hiding together. The students who normally joked constantly were silent. The people who usually argued with one another sat close together. Nobody cared about social groups, popularity, or small disagreements. We were simply a room full of frightened children waiting to find out whether someone was coming through the door. I remember thinking about my family. I wondered whether they knew what was happening. I imagined them hearing about the lockdown and trying to call me. I wanted to send a message, but I was afraid my phone might make a sound. Even if it was on silent, The light from the screen felt too bright in the dark room. I may have sent something short, or I may have been too afraid to do anything. The details are unclear now, but the need to reach my family was overwhelming. I wanted them to know I loved them. That thought frightened me, because it made the danger feel real. People usually think about final messages when they believe something terrible may happen. I did not want to believe that, but my mind kept going there. The teacher tried to remain calm for us. Teachers are placed in an impossible position during situations like that. They are frightened too, but they are expected to protect the students, control the room, and make decisions without knowing what is happening outside. Our teacher had to make sure the door was secure. They had to keep everyone quiet. They had to watch for updates while also preventing panic. I could see that they were trying not to show fear. That helped a little, but it also made me understand how serious the situation was. If the teacher had treated it like an ordinary drill, perhaps we would have relaxed. Instead, they remained focused and tense. Minutes passed slowly. Time feels different when you are waiting for danger. A few minutes can feel like half an hour. Every second becomes noticeable, because there is nothing to do except listen. Nobody was teaching. Nobody was moving. Nobody knew when the lockdown would end. I remember the discomfort of sitting on the floor and trying not to shift my weight. My legs became stiff, but moving felt too risky. Someone near me breathed heavily. Another student quietly cried. The room smelled like dust, old carpet, and too many frightened people packed into one space. Those small details became very clear because we were so focused on our surroundings. At some point, we heard movement outside. Everyone became even more still. The sound may have been police officers searching the building, but we did not know that. The footsteps moved through the hallway. They stopped near doors. Then they continued. My heart beat so loudly that I wondered whether other people could hear it. I imagined the door handle moving. I imagined the lock failing. I imagined someone entering with a weapon. Nothing happened. The footsteps moved away. The room slowly began breathing again. But the fear did not leave. We knew the person could still be somewhere else in the school. The waiting continued. There was no way for us to see what was happening outside. The blinds were closed, the lights were off, and the door remained locked. The classroom became our entire world. Everything beyond the walls was unknown. I thought about what I would do if someone entered. Lockdown drills sometimes teach students to remain hidden, block doors, or prepare to fight, only if there is no other choice. In a real moment, those instructions feel completely different. I looked around for anything that could be used to protect myself. A chair, a heavy book, something to throw. The object seemed useless against a gun. I was still young, and I did not want to fight anyone. I wanted an adult to solve the problem. I wanted the police to catch the person. I wanted the announcement to say it was over. Mostly I wanted to cry and go home. The person involved was apparently not mentally well. I do not know the full details of their condition or what led them to create the situation. At the time, that information did not matter to us. We did not know whether they understood what they were doing. We did not know whether they intended to hurt someone. We did not know whether they had a weapon ready to use. All we knew was that the threat was serious enough for the school to lock every classroom and bring in police. Later, we learned that the person had been caught. No shots were fired. Nobody in the school was killed or injured by gunfire. That was the best possible outcome. But during the lockdown, we did not have that knowledge. We experienced the fear as though the worst might happen at any moment. The difference between actual danger and expected danger can feel very small to the body. Our bodies reacted to the possibility. Our hearts raced. Our muscles tightened. Some students cried or shook. We prepared for something terrible, even though it never came. Eventually, an announcement or message told us the person had been taken into custody and the danger was over. Even then, the room did not immediately return to normal. Nobody suddenly laughed or stood up as if nothing had happened. We moved carefully. People asked whether it was really safe. The teacher waited for official confirmation before unlocking the door. When the lights came back on, the classroom looked exactly the same as it had before. The desks were still there. Books and papers remained where students had left them. Nothing had been damaged. Yet the room felt different. We had spent all that time imagining someone entering and killing us. The walls no longer felt completely safe. Some students hugged one another. Others checked their phones immediately and saw messages from worried parents. People who had held back tears finally started crying. The relief was powerful, but it came with exhaustion. Fear uses a huge safe. Some students hugged one another. Others checked their phones immediately and saw messages from worried parents. People who had held back tears finally amount of energy. Once the danger was over, I felt drained. My body had been tense for so long that I almost felt weak. I wanted to leave the school as quickly as possible. I did not care about the rest of the classes or the normal schedule. The idea of continuing the day as though nothing had happened felt impossible. Parents began arriving or calling. News spread quickly. People outside the school had probably heard that there was a possible shooting or armed person on campus. They may not have known whether anyone had been hurt. My family must have been terrified while waiting for information. That realization made me understand the event from another side. Inside the classroom, we had each other and a teacher. Outside, parents had almost no control. They could not enter the building. They could not reach their children safely. They could only wait for messages from the police or school. The waiting must have been terrible for them too. When I finally saw my family, I felt safe enough to fully react. During the lockdown, I had tried to stay quiet and controlled. Afterward, the emotions came out. I could admit how scared I had been. I could cry without worrying that the sound would place anyone in danger. The person had been caught, and no shots had been fired, but that did not make the fear disappear instantly. For days afterward, I kept thinking about the lockdown. I replayed the footsteps in the hallway. I remembered the dark room and the locked door. I remembered wondering whether I should send a final message to my family. I remembered trying not to cry. Ordinary school sounds became more noticeable. A book dropping in another classroom could make people jump. A loud bang from construction or a locker closing could cause a sudden wave of fear. Announcements over the speaker made everyone quiet for a moment. We had learned how quickly the school could change from a normal place into a possible danger zone. Before the incident, lockdown drills had felt like another school requirement. Afterward, they felt real. I understood why teachers were strict about silence and keeping away from doors. I understood why phones had to be muted. I understood why the door needed to be locked immediately. At the same time, future drills became more uncomfortable because they brought back the memory. Even when we knew it was only practice, part of my body remembered the real lockdown. The incident also changed the way I thought about school shootings. Before it happened, they were stories on the news. They happened in other cities and other schools. I felt sad or frightened when I heard about them, but there was still a distance between those events and my life. During our lockdown, that distance disappeared. For a period of time, I believed we might become one of those stories. I imagined news cameras outside the school. I imagined people saying the names of victims. I wondered whether my class would be able to escape. Those thoughts are too heavy for any student to carry, but many children now know exactly what that fear feels like. We were lucky. The person was stopped. No shots were fired. We all went home. Other students in other schools have experienced the same beginning and a very different ending. That knowledge made our relief feel mixed with sadness. I knew how frightening the waiting had been without hearing a single gunshot. I could not imagine what it would be like to hear shots in the hallway or lose a classmate. The anticipation alone had been terrifying. The word anticipation almost sounds too mild. It was not like waiting for a test result or waiting for an important announcement. It was waiting to find out whether someone was coming to hurt us. Every moment contained the possibility of sudden violence. Nothing happened, but something could have. That possibility was enough to make the experience unforgettable. I also thought about the person who caused the lockdown. Later, people said the person was not mentally well. I do not know what help they had received before the incident, or whether anyone had noticed warning signs. It is possible they were experiencing a serious mental health crisis and did not fully understand the fear they were causing. That does not remove the danger or excuse threatening a school, but it made the story more complicated. The person was not simply a movie villain. They were likely someone whose life or mind had reached a dangerous point. The police had to stop them, but afterward, I hope they also received proper treatment. A person can be both unwell and dangerous. Recognizing illness does not mean ignoring the risk. It means trying to prevent the situation before it reaches a school full of frightened students. I wondered whether someone could have intervened earlier. Maybe there had been threats. Maybe family members had concerns. Perhaps the person had tried to get help and failed. I never learned enough to know. What I knew was the result. A school went into lockdown. Children hid in dark classrooms. Parents feared they might never see their children again. Police searched the building. All of that happened, even though no trigger was pulled. People sometimes say that because no shots were fired, everything was fine. I understand what they mean. The outcome was safe. Nobody was physically injured by gunfire, but emotionally, it was not nothing. Students experienced real fear. The teachers carried responsibility for protecting us. Families waited for news. The school had to deal with the aftermath. A threat can leave damage even when the threatened act never happens. For some students, the fear may have faded quickly. They may have returned the next day and treated it as an intense story to tell. For others, it may have remained much longer. Everyone responds differently. I remember wanting to cry more than anything. That feeling stayed with me because I had to suppress it. Crying is one way the body releases fear, but during the lockdown, I believed even that could be dangerous. I had to remain quiet while my entire body wanted to react. There was nowhere to run. There was no action I could take to end the threat. All I could do was hide and wait. Helplessness is what made the experience so terrifying. If there had been a fire, we could have moved toward an exit. If someone had been injured in the classroom, we could have called for help. During a possible shooting, opening the door or leaving the room could place everyone in greater danger. Safety meant staying still. Safety meant silence. Safety meant trusting people outside the room to stop the threat. That lack of control made every minute harder. I remember looking at the door and thinking about how ordinary it was. It had a lock, but it was still only a classroom door. I wondered whether it would hold if someone tried to force it open. I wondered whether we should push desks against it. I wondered whether doing that would make too much noise. The teacher had to make those choices quickly. There was no perfect plan. We followed instructions and hoped they were enough. The person was caught before reaching us. I do not know how close they ever came to our classroom. Maybe they were on the other side of the school. Maybe they never entered the building. Perhaps the police had them under control much earlier than we knew. But while hiding, distance did not matter. Without information, the threat felt as though it could be directly outside our door. The mind brings danger closer when it cannot see it. That is why every footstep felt important. The silence made us imagine the worst. After the incident, school officials may have explained what happened and offered support. I do not remember every announcement or meeting. What I remember is the personal experience, the dark classroom, the other students pressed close together, the teacher trying to remain calm, the sound of movement outside, the desire to cry, the relief when we learned no shots had been fired. The event did not end with blood or physical injury, which is why I sometimes hesitate to call it a school shooting story. Technically, there was a threat, a person was caught, and the feared shooting never took place. But to those of us hiding in the room, the distinction came later. During the lockdown, it felt like a shooting could begin at any second. The fear was based on what we believed might happen, not on what had already happened. That fear was enough. I still feel grateful to the people who stopped the person. Police officers entered a situation without knowing exactly what they would face. School staff followed safety procedures. Teachers protected students. Someone made the decisions that prevented the incident from becoming a tragedy. Because of those actions, the story ended with everyone alive. I never want to forget that part. It is easy to focus only on the fear, but the safe outcome mattered. The system worked well enough that no shots were fired. The person was taken into custody. We were allowed to leave our hiding places. We went home to our families. That was a gift, even though the experience was terrifying. Years later, the memory is not about something I saw. I did not see a weapon. I did not see the person. I did not see the police capture them. My memory is mostly about waiting. It is about what the mind creates when it expects danger. It is about how a room full of students becomes completely silent. It is about how loud a hallway can sound when you are listening for a gunshot. It is about wanting to cry, but being afraid to make a sound. No shots were fired. Nobody burst through the door. The person was caught. But for the time we were hiding, none of us knew that would be the ending. We sat together, frightened and helpless, waiting to find out whether we would be safe. That anticipation was one of the most terrifying things I have ever experienced. There was a disappearance I once heard about that has always stayed with me because of how ordinary the beginning sounded. It was not a story about someone walking alone through a dangerous forest or getting into a stranger's car. It began with children walking home together at night. A little girl was with her older sister and one of their cousins. They should have reached home safely as a group. Instead, the older children kept teasing and bullying the younger girl, and a cruel decision made in the moment may have led to something none of them could ever take back. I do not know every detail of the case, and some parts may have been reported differently over the years. What I remember most is the simple chain of events. The three girls were walking home after dark. The youngest girl was being picked on by the older sister and cousin. They teased her while they walked, and the bullying continued until they reached the house. Instead of letting her inside with them, the two older children locked her out. They may have thought it was only a joke. Children can be cruel without fully understanding the danger they are creating. They may laugh when someone becomes upset because they do not believe anything truly serious will happen. They assume an adult will appear, the door will be opened, everyone will calm down, and the incident will become another family argument that is forgotten by the next day. But that night, the little girl was left outside. She was younger than the other two, already upset from being teased, and now she could not enter her own home. It was dark, and she apparently did not have an adult nearby who could immediately help her. The people she had trusted to walk home with her had gone inside and left her alone. I often wonder what she did during those first few minutes. Maybe she knocked on the door and asked them to let her in. Perhaps she cried, shouted, or tried another entrance. She may have believed her sister and cousin would quickly become bored and unlock the door. When that did not happen, she had to make a decision. She could remain outside and hope someone noticed her, or she could walk back toward town and try to contact her parents. For a young child alone at night, neither option would have felt safe. Eventually, she walked back into town. The distance may not have seemed very far during the earlier walk when she had been with her sister and cousin. Walking the same road alone in the dark would have felt completely different. Every shadow could have looked like a person. Every passing vehicle may have made her nervous. Houses that seemed normal during the day may have looked strange at night. She was probably still thinking about what had happened at home. She may have been angry, frightened, embarrassed, or all of those things at once. She might have wanted her parents to come home and punish the older girls. More than anything, she probably wanted a trusted adult to pick her up and take her somewhere safe. This happened during a time when public payphones were common. A child who needed help could find a phone booth or a payphone outside a business and try to call home. The girl reached a payphone in town. That is one of the final places where she was reportedly seen. At some point, her parents received a telephone call, but the person speaking was not their daughter. It was an unknown man. The man told the parents he was with their daughter. He said they should come and pick her up. That call must have been confusing and frightening. The parents may not have even known their daughter had been locked out. They may have believed she was safely at home with her sister and cousin. Suddenly, a strange adult man was on the phone saying he was standing with their little girl somewhere in town. Perhaps the man sounded helpful. Maybe he claimed he had found her alone near the phone and was simply making sure she was safe. It is possible he gave directions to the payphone and told the parents to come quickly. There was no clear reason at first for the parents to believe the girl would disappear before they arrived. An adult was supposedly with her. He had taken the time to call them. From the outside, it might have sounded like he was doing the responsible thing. Still, the situation was deeply unsettling. Why was their young daughter in town alone at night? Why was she with a man they did not know? Why was he making the call instead of allowing her to speak directly to them? Did the parents hear their daughter in the background? Did the man explain his name or how he had found her? Did he sound calm, nervous, friendly, or demanding? Those details would have mattered, but I do not know them. What is known from the account is that witnesses reportedly saw a young girl in or near the phone booth with an unknown man. That means the man was probably not just a voice on the telephone. Other people may have physically seen someone standing with the child. The witnesses may not have understood they were watching the final known moments before a disappearance. To them, it could have looked like a father standing with his daughter, an uncle helping a child use the phone, or a local adult assisting someone who was lost. Most people do not immediately assume a crime is happening when they see an adult beside a child in public. Unless the child is screaming, fighting, or clearly asking for help, the scene may look normal. That is one of the most disturbing parts of the story. Something terrible can happen in a public place, while everyone nearby believes they are seeing an ordinary family moment. The parents traveled to the phone booth as quickly as they could. They expected to find their daughter waiting there. Perhaps they imagined her crying beside the phone, angry about being locked outside. They might have already been planning what to say to the older sister and cousin. They may have felt embarrassed that a stranger had needed to help their child. But when they arrived, the phone booth was empty. The little girl was gone. The man was gone too. There was no one waiting to explain where they had gone. The parents must have felt immediate panic. A few minutes earlier, they had been told exactly where their daughter was. Now the place was empty, and the person who had called them could not be found. They may have searched the area around the booth, checking nearby streets, shops, parking areas, and alleys. Perhaps they called the girl's name and asked anyone nearby whether they had seen which direction she went. Witnesses could say that a little girl had been there with a man, but apparently no one knew enough to bring her back. Maybe someone saw them walk away. Perhaps a vehicle had been parked nearby. The man could have claimed he was taking her somewhere warmer or safer while they waited. The girl may have followed because she believed he was helping, or he may have forced, threatened, or tricked her. Without knowing exactly what witnesses saw, it is impossible to say. The police were contacted, and the search began. When a child disappears, every minute matters. Officers would need a description of the girl, her clothing, her age, and the place where she was last seen. They would also need every possible detail about the unknown man. What did he look like? How old did he seem? What was he wearing? Did he have a car? How did he speak? Was he from the area? Had anyone seen him before? Witness memories can be unreliable, especially when people did not realize they were observing something important. A person may remember a general impression, but not enough to identify a suspect. Someone might recall that the man was tall, but not remember his hair. Another person may remember a coat, but not the color. A witness may be certain a vehicle was nearby, while another remembers no vehicle at all. As time passes, those memories become even less clear. The phone call itself may have offered clues, but older telephone systems did not always make calls easy to trace. A payphone could be used without leaving a name or address. Unless police arrived quickly or the man had been recognized, he could disappear into the night. The search likely expanded beyond the town. Police, family members, and volunteers may have checked roads, fields, wooded areas, buildings, and places where a child could hide. They may have searched water, asked drivers whether they had seen anyone, and questioned people who lived near the phone booth. The parents would have hoped that their daughter had become frightened and hidden somewhere nearby. Maybe she had walked away from the strange man. Perhaps she had tried to find another route home. There was still a chance that she would appear at a neighbor's house or be found asleep in a shed or doorway. As the hours passed, that hope would have become more difficult to hold. Night would have turned into morning, and the girl still had not returned. The older sister and cousin would have been questioned about what happened before the disappearance. At first, they may have tried to make the incident sound smaller than it was. Children often hide wrongdoing because they are afraid of punishment. They may have said the younger girl walked away on her own, or that they thought she had entered the house through another door. Eventually, the truth came out that they had teased her and locked her outside. I cannot imagine the reaction inside that family. The parents were searching for a missing child while also learning that two other children had deliberately kept her from entering the house. Anger would have mixed with terror. There would have been questions that nobody could answer. Why did you lock her out? How long was she outside? Why did you not tell anyone she was missing? Did you see which way she went? Why did you think it was funny? The older children may not have had any answer beyond the truth that it was supposed to be a joke. That explanation would never feel large enough for what followed. A careless act that lasted only a few moments had placed the youngest girl alone on the road at night. If she had been allowed inside, she would not have needed to walk back into town. She would not have gone to the payphone. She may never have met the unknown man. That does not mean the sister and cousin caused whatever the man may have done. The adult who took advantage of a child would be responsible for that. But the older children probably understood that their decision created the situation. That kind of guilt can destroy a person from the inside. Imagine being told that the last thing you did to your younger sister was tease her, shut the door, and refuse to let her into the house. At the time, you expected to see her again in a few minutes. Instead, she disappeared forever. Every family argument afterward might bring the memory back. Every birthday, holiday, and empty chair could remind you of that night. You might replay the moment again and again, imagining yourself opening the door instead. You would think about how easy it would have been. Turn the lock, let her inside, say the joke is over. One small movement could have changed everything. People looking at the case from the outside might blame the sister and cousin harshly. Some might call them cruel or say they deserve to feel guilty. But they were also children. Children do not have the same understanding of risk as adults. They may know that locking someone outside is mean, but they do not truly imagine kidnapping, murder, or a permanent disappearance. They expect adults to protect the world from becoming that dangerous. Their behavior was wrong, but they may have spent the rest of their lives paying emotionally for something they did before they understood how serious the consequences could be. The parents would have carried their own guilt too. Parents of missing children often question every earlier choice, even when they had no way to predict what would happen. They may wonder why they were not home, why they did not check sooner, or why the girls were walking at night. They may blame themselves for trusting the older children to stay together. They may even question the phone call. Should they have told the man to keep their daughter on the line? Should they have contacted the police immediately? Could they have reached the payphone faster? These questions can continue for years because there is no answer that changes the outcome. The most painful part of an unsolved disappearance is the uncertainty. If a body is found, the truth is terrible, but the family can begin to understand what happened. When someone simply vanishes, every possibility remains alive. The girl could have been killed soon after she left the phone booth. She could have been taken far away. She might have lived under another name. Someone may have known exactly what happened and remained silent. The family could never fully grieve because part of them would always wonder whether she might still return. Every unknown telephone call could create hope. Every child seen from a distance might make someone look twice. As the missing girl grew older in their minds, the family might imagine what she would look like at each age. Police could create updated images showing how her face may have changed. But those images would only be guesses. The real girl remained frozen in time as the child who walked to the payphone. Cases like this often become part of local memory. People tell the story to younger generations. The phone booth may become known as the last place the girl was seen. Residents who were children at the time grow into adults, still wondering who the man was. Some people may believe they remember seeing him. Others may create theories. Perhaps he was passing through town and noticed a vulnerable child. Maybe he lived nearby and already knew the family's routine. He could have seen the girl walking alone and followed her to the phone. It is also possible that he approached after she arrived and offered help. The fact that he called the parents is especially strange. If he intended to abduct her from the beginning, why alert the family to his presence? Maybe he wanted to make himself appear trustworthy. Perhaps the girl refused to go with him until she believed her parents knew where she was. By calling them, he could have convinced her that everything was safe. He may have said, "Your parents are coming. We can wait somewhere warm." Then he could have moved her away from the phone booth before they arrived. Another possibility is that the situation changed after the call. He might originally have planned to help, then made a terrible decision. But without evidence, that remains only speculation. The call could also have been a way to control the timing. By knowing the parents were traveling toward the booth, the man knew how long he had before they arrived. He could leave the area before they reached it. Whatever his reason, the telephone call became part of the mystery. The witnesses who saw the girl with him probably lived with their own questions. One may have wondered whether they should have approached the booth. Another may have thought the girl looked uncomfortable, but decided not to interfere. after the disappearance became public. Ordinary details from the scene may have taken on new meaning. Was the man holding her arm? Did the girl appear frightened? Was she looking toward the road as though waiting for someone? Did the man watch the people around him? At the time, none of those things may have seemed important. Later, every small movement could feel like a missed warning. That is one reason disappearances trouble entire communities. Many people begin wondering whether they could have prevented what happened. The little girl had already experienced rejection that night. Her sister and cousin had made her feel unwanted and shut her out of the place where she should have been safe. When the unknown man offered help, she may have been especially willing to trust him. A frightened child wants an adult to take control. If he spoke gently and said he would help contact her parents, she may have seen him as the only kind person available. Predators often use trust rather than force. They offer a ride, food, warmth, or assistance. A child does not need to be foolish to believe them. Children are taught to seek adults when they are lost or in trouble. The danger is that not every adult is safe. I think about the moment the parents reached the booth and saw no one there. They may have first assumed they were at the wrong phone. Then, they might have checked the surrounding area, expecting their daughter to step out from behind a building. After a few minutes, the truth would begin to form. The man had taken her somewhere. The parents had spoken to the person who was last seen with their child, and now they had no way to reach him again. That realization must have been unbearable. They would replay his voice in their minds. Was there an accent? Did he sound young or old? Had there been traffic or music in the background? Did he say anything that could identify him? The voice of a stranger may have become one of the most important memories of their lives. Years later, they might still hear it clearly or worry that they had forgotten something important. The case remained unsolved. The girl was never found. No final answer came for the family. There may have been suspects, reported sightings, and new searches over the years, but none of them brought the child home or proved exactly what happened. An unsolved case can slowly become quieter in public while remaining completely alive for the family. News coverage decreases. Posters disappear. Investigators retire. The phone booth may be removed. Businesses close and streets change. But for the people who loved the missing child, the case never becomes old. It remains the night she did not come home. The older sister and cousin would grow up. They would become adults, while the missing girl remained a child in photographs. They might marry, have children, and reach ages the little girl never had the chance to reach in the family's memory. Having children of their own may have made the guilt even stronger. Once they understood how vulnerable a young child truly is, they could look back on their actions with adult knowledge. They may have watched their own children argue with siblings and felt panic whenever someone threatened to lock another child outside. Perhaps they became extremely protective parents. Maybe they found it difficult to talk about the missing girl at all. People handle guilt in different ways. One person may speak about the event constantly, hoping confession will reduce the pain. Another may avoid the subject because it is too difficult to face. The sister and cousin may also have blamed each other. Each could say the other had the idea or turned the lock. Family relationships can break under that kind of pressure. The parents may have struggled to forgive them, even while knowing they were children too. There was no easy place to put the anger. The unknown man was gone. The youngest daughter was gone. The remaining family members were left with one another and the memory of the decision that sent her back into town. It is a sad story from every direction. It is sad for the little girl who only wanted to get inside her home and ended up alone at night. It is sad for the parents who arrived only minutes too late and spent the following years without answers. It is sad for the witnesses who may not have understood what they were seeing. It is even sad for the older sister and cousin. Despite their cruel behavior, because they may have carried a lifetime of guilt for something they expected to be a temporary joke. The story is also frightening because the danger did not begin with a dramatic attack. It began with children being mean to another child. Most families have moments when siblings tease each other, argue, or shut a door. Usually an adult steps in, someone apologizes, and life continues. In this case, the ordinary cruelty created an opening for something much darker. That does not mean every childish prank leads to disaster. It means small actions can sometimes place someone in danger without anyone realizing it until too late. I cannot imagine what the little girl thought while standing at the payphone. She may have been relieved when the man offered to help. Perhaps she watched him dial the number and listened as he spoke to her parents. Once the call ended, she probably believed they were coming. She may have asked how long they would be. The man could have told her to wait with him. Then, before the parents arrived, they left the booth. Was she frightened at that moment? Did she go willingly because he promised to take her somewhere nearby? Did she realize something was wrong and try to resist? Those questions have no confirmed answers. That is what makes the final image so painful. A small girl beside a public telephone. A strange man standing with her. Parents driving toward them. Then, an empty booth. The distance between rescue and disappearance may have been only a few minutes. The parents could have been traveling down the road while their daughter was being led away. They may even have passed the man's vehicle without knowing it. When they arrived, the chance was already gone. People often say they cannot imagine what the family felt, and that is probably true. Most of us can understand sadness, fear, and guilt separately. This family would have experienced all of them at once. The parents feared for their missing child. They were angry at the older girls. The sister and cousin feared punishment and also feared what might have happened. Everyone waited for a call that could provide an answer. Days became weeks. Weeks became years. The girl did not return. The story has no satisfying ending. There was no final rescue, confession, or discovery. The unknown man was never clearly identified, and the child was never found. All that remains is the chain of events, and the possibility that one different choice could have changed everything. Had the older girls opened the door, the little girl would have been home. Had a neighbor noticed her outside, she might have been taken somewhere safe. Had a witness at the phone booth recognized the danger, someone might have intervened. Had the parents arrived a few minutes earlier, they might have seen the man. But history cannot be changed by imagining different endings. The family had to live with the ending they received, which was no ending at all. That is why the story stayed with me. It is not only a mystery about who the man was, it is a story about cruelty, vulnerability, mistiming, and guilt. A child was bullied by people close to her. She tried to solve the problem by calling her parents. A stranger appeared helpful. The parents were told where to find her. They arrived and found only an empty phone booth. After that, the little girl seemed to disappear from the world. I hope the family eventually found some form of peace, even without knowing exactly what happened. I hope the older sister and cousin were able to understand that while their actions were wrong. The responsibility for harming or taking the girl belonged to the adult who chose to exploit the situation. At the same time, I cannot imagine that knowledge completely removing their guilt. They would always remember the locked door. The last time they saw the little girl, she was outside because they had decided not to let her in. That would be a difficult memory for anyone to carry. The case remains one of those stories where the saddest part is not only that a child disappeared, it is that she came so close to being safe. Her home was right there. Her sister and cousin were inside. Her parents were on their way. She had reached a telephone and successfully contacted them. Every part of the situation seemed to be moving toward her being brought home. Then the unknown man and the girl vanished before the parents arrived. It was only a short period of time, but it was enough. The phone call that should have led to a reunion became the final confirmed connection between the child and her family. The parents heard that she was alive and waiting for them. Then, they never saw her again. That may be the most painful part of the entire story. They were not searching blindly at first. They knew exactly where she had been. They were traveling toward her. They believed they were about to pick her up. But when they reached the phone booth, she was already gone. The older sister and cousin may have spent the rest of their lives wishing they had opened the door. The parents may have spent the rest of theirs wishing they had reached the booth sooner. And somewhere in the middle of those regrets was a little girl who simply wanted to go home. The Kiss nightclub fire is one of the most painful tragedies in recent Brazilian history. Even now, years after it happened, it is difficult to think about the number of young lives lost in only a few minutes. The fire happened during a college party in January 2013 at a nightclub called Kiss in Santa Maria, Brazil. By the time it was over, 242 people had died. Most of the victims were very young. Many were between 18 and 28 years old. A large number of them were university students from Santa Maria. They had gone out expecting an ordinary night with friends. They wanted to listen to music, dance, celebrate, take pictures, and forget about classes and responsibilities for a few hours. For many of them, it was supposed to be one of those nights they would remember with happiness. Instead, it became the final night of their lives. The scale of the disaster made it one of the worst fire tragedies in Brazil. It was widely described as the second deadliest fire in the country's history, and one of the deadliest nightclub fires in the world. But numbers alone do not explain the true horror of what happened. Saying that 242 people died is almost too large for the mind to understand. It is easier to imagine one family waiting for one child to come home. Then imagine another family doing the same thing. Then another. Continue until hundreds of parents, brothers, sisters, partners, and friends are all waiting for news at the same time. Each person who died had a separate life. Each one had plans. Some were studying for careers they would never begin. Some were in relationships. Some had spoken to their parents only hours earlier. Some had probably promised to be home later or sent a message saying they were having fun. The nightclub was holding a university party when the fire began. The building was crowded with students and other young people. Music was playing, people were standing close together, and the room was dark in the way nightclubs usually are. A band was performing on stage. During the performance, the vocalist used a type of firework or flame effect. It was meant to be part of the show. In another building, with safer materials and better preparation, the effect might have lasted only a few seconds and then disappeared. Inside Kiss, the flames reached the foam installed on the ceiling. The foam caught fire. What began as a small stage effect quickly became something completely uncontrollable. At first, some people may not have understood that the fire was real. In a nightclub, flashing lights, smoke effects, loud music, and people shouting can hide danger for a few important seconds. Someone near the stage may have seen the flame touch the ceiling. People farther away may have only noticed that something unusual was happening. Perhaps they saw smoke forming overhead. Maybe they heard someone shouting about a fire, but thought it was part of the performance. Those first moments were critical. A nightclub full of people cannot empty quickly, especially when everyone is confused and the building has only one main way out. As the foam burned, it produced thick, toxic smoke. The smoke spread across the ceiling and then moved downward into the crowd. It did not behave like ordinary smoke from a small wood fire. The burning material released deadly chemicals that could quickly make people confused, weak, unconscious, or unable to breathe. The gas was later described as a cyanide-based poison. People compared it to the kind of deadly chemical associated with Nazi concentration camps during the Holocaust. That detail makes the tragedy even more horrifying. Many victims may not have died directly from flames. They were overcome by toxic smoke before they could escape. A person breathing that air might still have been able to stand and move for a short time. Then, dizziness, confusion, and weakness could begin. In a dark, crowded building, even a few seconds of confusion could be fatal. The lights were low, the music had been loud, and panic was spreading through hundreds of people at once. Everyone began moving toward safety. But the nightclub reportedly had only one main exit. That exit was not enough for the number of people inside. When a crowd becomes frightened, normal movement disappears. People do not walk calmly in a line. They push toward any place they believe may lead outside. Those closest to the door may be knocked down. The people behind them may not even see that someone has fallen. They only feel pressure from the crowd behind them and continue moving forward. Once bodies begin falling in a narrow path, the exit becomes even harder to reach. The nightclub was dark and smoke was filling the room. People could not clearly see where they were going. Some followed others without knowing whether they were moving toward the real exit. Many reportedly saw lights coming from the bathroom area and believed those lights showed another way out. They ran toward them. The bathrooms did not lead outside. People entered expecting to find an exit and instead became trapped. That is why so many victims were later found inside or near the bathrooms. It is one of the most heartbreaking details of the entire disaster. Those young people were trying to save themselves. They were not hiding or waiting for help. They were actively searching for a way out. They saw light and believed it meant safety. Instead, it led them into a closed area where the smoke continued to spread. Imagine reaching the bathroom and realizing there is no exit. More people are coming in behind you. You cannot move backward because the doorway is blocked by the crowd. The room is filling with smoke. People are coughing, screaming, and trying doors that do not lead anywhere. Some may have tried to break through walls or windows that did not exist. Others may have climbed over sinks or toilet stalls looking for another path. The toxic air would have made thinking clearly almost impossible. Phones may have been used to call parents, friends, police, or emergency services. Some victims may have sent final messages. Others probably never had the chance. Outside the nightclub, the scene was becoming chaotic. People who escaped tried to help those still inside. Some survivors reportedly went back toward the building because their friends had not come out. They may have escaped once and then entered the smoke again, believing they could save someone. That decision shows how quickly people can forget their own safety when someone they love is missing. Emergency workers began arriving. Firefighters, police officers, medical teams, and local people tried to rescue as many as possible. But the smoke was extremely dangerous, and the building was packed. Bodies had to be carried out. Some victims were still alive but unconscious. Others were already gone. Hospitals in the area suddenly had to deal with a huge number of injured young people suffering from burns, smoke inhalation, poisoning, crushing injuries, and panic. Doctors and nurses who had started an ordinary night shift were suddenly facing one of the largest disasters the country had ever seen. The tragedy did not remain inside the nightclub. It spread across Santa Maria within minutes. Parents began receiving calls. Some were told there had been a fire at the party their children were attending. Others saw messages online or heard about it from friends. At first, many families probably believed their child had escaped. They called again and again. Some phones rang without an answer. Other calls went directly to voicemail. A phone ringing is usually a hopeful sound because it means the device still exists and may be near its owner. That night, each unanswered ring must have felt worse than the one before it. Parents drove toward the nightclub, hospitals, police stations, and places where survivors were being taken. Nobody knew where to go. Information was confused. A student might have been taken to a hospital without identification. Someone could have escaped and gone to a friend's home. Another person might be missing in the crowd, but still alive. Families moved from one location to another, asking the same questions. Have you seen my son? Have you seen my daughter? Was this person brought here? Is this name on your list? The first hours after the fire were filled with hope, fear, and confusion. Families looked at injured survivors, trying to recognize someone they loved. They checked hospitals. They called friends. They searched social media. They stood outside emergency areas waiting for names to be announced. For some families, the news was that their child had survived. For others, there was no answer. As the number of dead became clearer, survivors and families were taken to places where victims were being identified. That process must have been unbearable. Parents who had last seen their children getting ready for a party were now being asked to identify them among the dead. Some victims may have been difficult to recognize because of smoke, injuries, or the conditions inside the building. Personal items became important. A necklace, a watch, a shoe, a piece of clothing, a phone. Something small could be the final proof of who a person was. A parent may have recognized the shirt their child wore when leaving the house. A friend may have identified a bracelet. Objects that had seemed ordinary only hours earlier became connected forever to death. The community was overwhelmed. Santa Maria was known as a university city filled with young students. After the fire, almost everyone knew someone who had died or knew a family affected by the tragedy. There were university classes with many empty seats. Friend groups were destroyed. Families lost more than one child or relative. Some survivors lost several close friends on the same night. Funerals happened across the city. There were too many coffins. The sound of crying filled homes, churches, and public spaces. Brazil watched the tragedy through television reports. Images of the nightclub, the emergency response, and the grieving families were shown across the country. People who had never visited Santa Maria cried for students they had never met. The victims were young enough that many viewers could imagine their own children, brothers, sisters, or classmates in the same situation. The cause of the fire seemed simple at first. A stage effect had set the ceiling foam on fire. But as investigators looked deeper, the disaster appeared to involve more than one bad decision. Questions were raised about the foam, the safety rules, the number of exits, the number of people inside, emergency signs, fire equipment, inspections, and who had allowed the nightclub to continue operating. A tragedy of that size usually does not happen because of only one mistake. It happens when several failures exist at the same time. The dangerous material should not have been where flames could reach it. The fire effect should not have been used inside without proper safety controls. The building should have had enough clear exits for the crowd. Emergency paths should have been easy to identify even in darkness and smoke. The club should not have been allowed to become a trap. If any one of those things had been different, many people might have survived. The single exit problem was especially important. A nightclub holding hundreds of people needs more than one safe way out. If fire blocks the main route or a crowd becomes trapped there, another exit can save lives. Inside KISS, people rushed toward the same area. Some reportedly had difficulty leaving during the first moments because staff or security workers may not have immediately understood the danger. In a nightclub, Staff might normally stop people from leaving without paying or from entering restricted areas. During a fire, even a short delay can cost lives. Whether every part of those accounts was proven or not, survivors described a situation where confusion and poor safety planning made escape much harder. The foam on the ceiling also became a symbol of carelessness. It was reportedly used for sound control, but when it burned, it produced deadly smoke. The victims were not only trapped by fire, they were poisoned by the air. People who appeared to have escaped without major burns later became seriously ill because of what they had breathed. Some survivors needed long hospital treatment. Their lungs and bodies had been damaged by smoke and chemicals. Others carried emotional injuries that could not be seen. They had watched friends collapse. They had stepped over bodies while trying to escape. Some had left someone behind because the smoke was too strong. Survivors' guilt can be crushing. A person may understand logically that they could not save everyone, but the mind continues asking questions. Why did I survive? Why did I leave through the correct door while my friend went toward the bathroom? Why did I let go of their hand? Could I have gone back? Could I have done more? Many survivors probably replayed the night again and again. A smell, a song, a dark room, or a crowded party could bring the memories back. Some may never have entered another nightclub. Parents who survived the loss of their children also had to continue living with questions. They wanted accountability. They wanted to know who had allowed the dangerous conditions. They wanted the people responsible to face real punishment. But the legal process became another source of pain. Years passed. Trials, appeals, decisions, and delays continued. For many families, it felt as though powerful people were being protected and responsibility was being moved from one person to another. At the time people marked 10 years since the tragedy, many still felt that nobody had been meaningfully punished. Those believed to be responsible remained free, and legal decisions had been suspended or challenged. The families had already waited a decade for justice. Every delay forced them to return to the details of the fire. They had to hear lawyers discuss technical points while their children remained dead. The legal system deals in documents, evidence, rules, and procedure. Grieving families deal in empty bedrooms, missed birthdays, and photographs. Those two worlds do not move at the same speed. To the courts, another delay may be part of the process. To a parent, it is another year without an answer. Political influence was also part of the public anger. Many people believed that officials or others with connections had avoided responsibility. Whether every accusation was proven or not, the feeling of protection and unfairness damaged public trust. The tragedy was not only about the night of the fire. It became a long story about how institutions respond after preventable deaths. Were inspections honest? Were licenses approved correctly? Were safety rules ignored? Did officials know about the risks? Who had the power to close the club before the fire? Who chose not to act? These questions matter because punishment is not only about revenge. Accountability shows that the deaths meant something and that similar carelessness will not be accepted again. Without it, families may feel that the system is telling them their children's lives were less important than protecting businesses, careers, or political connections. A decade after the fire, Netflix released a series called The Endless Night, based on the Kiss nightclub tragedy. Watching it was one of the most heartbreaking experiences I have ever had. The series does not treat the victims as only a number. It shows young people preparing for the party, families going through normal daily life, and students expecting an ordinary night. That makes what follows even more painful. You know the fire is coming. You know many of these people will not return home. The first episodes show the day of the tragedy and the beginning of the disaster. Watching young people laugh, make plans, and enter the nightclub is difficult because the audience already knows the ending. Every normal conversation feels important. A parent saying goodbye becomes painful. A small disagreement becomes something a person will later regret. A final message or hug becomes the last one without anyone realizing it. Then the fire begins. The confusion, darkness, smoke, and panic are shown in a way that makes the event feel close. Even though it is a drama, it is based on a real tragedy. That knowledge makes it difficult to watch. These are not invented victims created only for entertainment. Real families experienced versions of those moments. Real students searched for exits. Real people ran toward the bathroom lights. Real parents waited outside hospitals. The scenes of families trying to find their children are especially painful. The parents move through crowds, ask for information, and refuse to believe the worst until they have no choice. Some are told to wait. Some see lists. Others search among survivors. The emotional cruelty comes from not knowing. A parent can survive terrible news, but waiting between hope and certainty can feel endless. The title, The Endless Night, fits the tragedy because for many families, that night never truly ended. Morning arrived, but their children did not come home. Years passed, but the legal fight continued. They grew older while the victims remained forever young. The series shows that grief is not one moment of crying. It continues through funerals, investigations, court hearings, birthdays, anniversaries, and family gatherings. The empty space remains. I cried during every episode. There are 5 episodes, and each one finds another way to show the human cost of the tragedy. The first 2 were especially difficult because they focus on the fire and the immediate search for the victims. But the later episodes are painful in a different way. They show what happens after the news cameras leave. The families must continue fighting. Survivors must live with trauma. Parents become activists because they cannot accept that their children died for nothing. They attend hearings, speak publicly, and demand accountability, even when doing so forces them to relive the worst day of their lives. Some people may question whether a television series should be made about a real tragedy. That is understandable. Families may not want their loss turned into entertainment. Dramatization can simplify events or create scenes that did not happen exactly as shown. But a series can also keep public memory alive. Younger people who were children when the fire happened may learn about it for the first time. Viewers outside Brazil may understand the scale of the tragedy. The victims become more than a line in a history article. The series can remind people why fire codes, emergency exits, safe materials, and proper inspections are matters of life and death. Safety rules can feel annoying when nothing goes wrong. A venue owner may see extra exits or fire-resistant material as an unnecessary expense. A band may believe a small fire effect is harmless. An inspector may allow a problem to continue because closing the business would create conflict. But when several people ignore small risks, the result can be 242 deaths. The Kiss nightclub fire shows why prevention matters. Once the foam caught fire, there was very little time. Once toxic smoke filled the club, many victims had almost no chance. Once the crowd moved toward the single exit, the building became a trap. The important decisions had been made before the party began. What material was installed on the ceiling? How many people were allowed inside? Where were the exits? Were signs visible? Was the fire effect permitted? Did the staff know what to do? Were emergency systems working? Those choices decided how dangerous the night would become. The young people inside did not know they were entering a building where a small flame could lead to mass death. They trusted the owners, officials, staff, and safety system. That trust failed them. The families lost sons, daughters, brothers, sisters, partners, and friends because adults and institutions did not protect them properly. That is why the lack of punishment felt so unbearable. The victims followed the normal rules of life. They bought tickets, entered a nightclub, listened to music, and expected to go home. They did not choose the dangerous foam. They did not approve the building. They did not design the exits. They paid for other people's decisions with their lives. The bathroom detail remains one of the hardest parts for me. Those victims saw light and believed it led outside. In darkness and smoke, light usually means hope. They followed it because they wanted to live. When rescuers later found so many bodies there, it showed how badly the building's layout and emergency guidance had failed. The people were not too slow or foolish. They were confused in conditions that made clear thought almost impossible. A safe building should guide people out even when they are frightened. Emergency signs should remain visible. Exit routes should be clear. There should be more than one way to escape. At KISS, the victims had to make life or death decisions while blinded by smoke and surrounded by panic. Many chose the wrong direction because the building gave them no clear answer. The story is difficult to describe without feeling angry. There is grief for the victims and families, but also anger because the disaster appears so preventable. A natural disaster cannot always be stopped. An earthquake, storm, or flood may overwhelm even strong safety systems. This fire began with human decisions. Someone used a flame indoors. Dangerous foam was on the ceiling. The club had poor escape conditions. Rules and inspections did not prevent the risk. Then the legal system failed to provide the sense of justice many families expected. That makes the tragedy feel like more than a terrible accident. It feels like a chain of failures before, during, and after the fire. The young victims should now be adults in their 30s and 40s. They should have careers, relationships, children, and new worries. Their parents should be watching them build lives. Instead, their photographs remain connected to January 2013. The families age while the faces in the pictures stay the same. Every anniversary brings the number back. 242. But behind that number are 242 separate absences. A mother who no longer receives a call. A sibling who has one less person at the table. A friend who still remembers the final message. A classroom with an empty seat. A future that stopped before it really began. The KISS nightclub fire is not only one of Brazil's worst disasters. It is a warning about what happens when safety is treated as optional and responsibility is avoided. It is also a story about grief that does not end when the fire is extinguished. The flames lasted for a short time. The consequences have lasted for years. The families continued searching for justice. Survivors continued living with trauma. The country continued asking how so many young people could die in a place meant for music and celebration. Watching the endless night brought all of that pain back. The series made the victims feel close. It showed the parents waiting, searching, refusing to give up, and then being forced to face the truth. I cried through all 5 episodes because it was impossible to separate the story on the screen from the real people behind it. The first 2 episodes were especially soul-crushing. They showed the ordinary day before the fire, the party, the sudden disaster, and the families trying to find their children. The parents did not know whether their sons and daughters were injured, missing, alive, or dead. They moved through the endless night holding on to hope, because letting go was impossible. Some eventually found their children alive. Many did not. For those families, the nightclub fire never became only history. It remained personal. It remained the final place their children went. It remained the night a stage flame touched the ceiling. Toxic smoke filled a crowded room, and hundreds of young people searched for an exit that was not there. It remained the night light led students toward a bathroom instead of safety. It remained the night parents arrived too late. And a decade later, for many of them, justice still felt out of reach. That is why the story is so heartbreaking. It began as a college party. It ended as one of the worst fire tragedies Brazil had ever seen. 242 people died, most of them young students with their entire lives ahead of them. Their families were left with memories, court battles, unanswered questions, and a grief that no verdict could fully repair. The fire ended that night. For the people who lost someone, the night never truly ended. The stories may be over, but some nights do not end when the video does. The people you heard tonight were not looking for fear. They were living normal lives until one moment changed the way they saw the world around them. Tell me in the comments which story stayed with you the longest. Subscribe to Nockmeyer Witness for more true accounts from people who saw something they wish they could forget. Good night, and if you wake up suddenly, do not assume it was just a dream.